please ask your question through the Q&A function that you can see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure that we keep an eye on these questions and raise those questions when we get to the Q&A session. Please note that the questions should be directed preferably to specific persons, if possible. And also please direct those questions to the four speakers that are also authors of this volume. So therefore, Tanya, Mera, Mark Ecker, Sophia Koller, and myself, but not to Martin Meder from the NCTV. And that is because also we are very, very happy to have Martin with us, and because this project has benefited from the very kind support of the Dutch Counter-Terrorism Coordinator, the NCTV. And this research would not have been possible without this support. And for this reason, we would like to also give the floor to the NCTV for some introductory remarks. And to do that, we're very happy to have with us Martin Meder, who is a senior analyst at the Dutch NCTV, where he's been working for quite some time now, since 2008, Martin, on counterterrorism issue, both as a policy and analyst. So Martin, I will give you the floor right now.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I will give a brief introduction about the NCTV, and after that I will tell a bit about the importance of academic research and the connection we have with ICT. Furthermore, I will touch upon the benefits of the report shortly, and I will finalize my introduction, which will last 5 minutes, so you will overcome it. I hope so, with a question. About the NCTV, the NCTV was established in 2004-2005 in reaction to the terrorist threat at that moment, both in Europe and in the Netherlands. In the first decade, it was solely focused on countering terrorism, as well as civil aviation security and the protection and surveillance of dignitaries of state, as well as foreign embassies and international organizations. Since then, the National Coordinator for Counterterrorism, Pieter-Jaap Albersberg, has also been responsible for the coordination of the response to cybersecurity threats and state actor threats. The NCTV is by nature and in itself a fusion center. We do not collect operational data ourselves. That's collected by intelligence and security and intelligence services. What we do is we write reports about phenomena based on intelligence we get from the police, the security and intelligence services, as well as open source intelligence and very important academic insights, including insights from think and do like tanks like the ICCT. Hence, we have been supportive of the ICCT since its start in several ways. One of the ways is financially. Academic research is very important for us in numerous ways. For instance, it fills knowledge gaps, it improves our critical thinking and analysis, and it improves our analytical base for new or existing policies. And that last remark is very important. Change in policies are preferably based on analytical insights. That's the basis of our existence and of our organization. And the ambition for the years ahead will to adopt a more knowledge-driven approach. We always had a practice-based approach based on experience in practice. What we want to do in the future more is evidence-based or data-driven based approach. This will result in both, we hope, the monitoring of effective elements and the more systematic monitoring of long-term effects. For these reasons, both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well as the NCTV support the ICCT financially and in other ways. We have financed this report in particular because it fills knowledge gaps and it improves our understanding of the problems we face while rehabilitating and reintegrating convicted and incarcerated female jihadists. Needless to say, but the NCTV did not have any influence on the methodology of the researchers or the content of the report. In fact, our organization did not see the full text until very recently, which explains the rather content-free nature of my contribution. The comparative nature of the study gives us not only the opportunity to compare the threats related to incarcerated female jihadists in the Netherlands and three of its neighbors, but also the policy approaches to mitigate these threats and to reintegrate the jihadist offenders. Therefore, this report gives us the opportunity to discuss existing threats and policy in a systematic manner. But it also offers us ways to improve our approach. Ladies and gentlemen, I come to my final remark, and that's a question. I was a bit surprised by a conclusion in an interview that Tanja Mera, one of the main researchers, gave to a Dutch newspaper. According to that article in that newspaper today, recidivism occurs mainly shortly after release. Could Tanja or one of the other researchers elaborate a bit on this topic? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Martijn. And indeed, we won't miss to address your last question in the context of our presentation. And precisely just to explain a bit the orchestration of this event, we will ask all four authors, experts here, to briefly present some of the key findings from their research in their respective countries. So Belgium, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And then after that, I will follow up with a few specific questions for each author. And then after that, we'll open the floor for questions and answers from the floor. So having said this, I will start with a very brief introduction about the rationale and the methodology of this project, just because I think it is important for you to understand how this project developed and what is the methodology that we applied through this project. The first observation, or sort of the first element that triggered this project, was the fact and the realization that women have constituted a significant minority of the violent extremist population, particularly in Europe, over the past decade. And so women in terrorism movement is not something that is entirely new, but particularly in Europe, they have sort of evolved from a role that it was rather invisible to a role that became much more prominent and visible, and certainly visible to the counterterrorism community. And as a matter of fact, some of these women even proved quite dangerous, being involved in plots or attacks here in Europe. And at the same time, little is known about this woman. And because there's been a limited, even though growing over the past few years, literature on this topic. But even more so, we know quite little, and we have studied quite little how to manage female violent extremist offenders. So that was one of the first point or observation that sort of led us to start this project. The second one was that in many international forums, many international organizations, you hear discussion about basically bringing more gender into consideration for counterterrorism policies and practice. But it's not always clear what these gender sensitive or gender specific approaches for counterterrorism, what does that actually mean concretely? And so we wanted to basically scratch a little bit below the surface to understand really what are the potential bias in the criminal justice system, or what gender specific approaches for prison management or rehabilitation could mean in the context of managing female violent extremist offenders. So these two aspects, or these two gaps, knowledge gaps, evidence gaps, basically drove the motivation and the thinking underpinning this project. In terms of methodology, therefore, when we decided to start this project with the kind support of the NCTV, we had to devise a methodology that would basically address the gaps that I just mentioned. And one of the common problems we have, or that we're facing with when dealing with female violent extremist offenders, is the relatively low number, the low N. And so to address that point, we decided to cover several countries at the same time to basically enlarge that sample, that data set that we could study. But for consistency purposes, we focused on female jihadis exclusively, so we excluded other ideologies involved in terrorism after 2012, so that basically the profiles, the motivations could be more comparable across the countries, and also the security context was more comparable across these neighboring countries. Then what we decided to do was to collect court cases involving female violent extremist offenders, which is an interesting material to use in the context of this research. And we collected 283 court cases concerning 277 female violent extremist offenders, which is a truly unique data set that we've been able to build for this study. We collected these court cases. We coded data from these court cases through a template that we built together, all four authors here, together with Merlina Herbach, also a researcher at ICCD, also contributed to this volume. And so after several discussions to basically reach a common language between us, but also to know what kind of data could realistically be compiled across these different countries, we did build this data set, this template, which basically include different criteria such as age, nationality, criminal records, indictment period, charges, sentence, activities, etc. And then what we did was to allow for this data that was now coded to be analyzed systematically at the national level and also at the cross-cutting level. We completed this data set with a number of interviews. 69 stakeholders in total were interviewed for this project across the 4 countries. We targeted the same types of stakeholders across the 4 countries: prosecutors, prison staff, rehabilitation staff, probation staff, security services. And we interviewed all of these individuals through semi-structured interviews. So this book that sort of brings us together here includes country chapters, so analysis at the level of the country, as well as a cross-cutting analysis comparing across countries, as well as case studies. We thought it was interesting to highlight some specific cases of female involved in violent extremist offenders to illustrate what we are saying in this book, as well as recommendations. To do this project, and finally, we had to rely on country experts because we could not do this on our own across 4 countries. So we needed these country experts, which have the expertise, but also the network and the credibility within the respective countries to do this research, which basically brings me to introduce the brilliant team of experts that is sitting here with me, with you for this event. So we have with us today Marc Hecker, who is the Deputy Director of the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI, Institut Français des Relations Internationales, and Editor-in-Chief of Politique Étrangère, their academic journal. He holds a PhD from Université Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne and published several books on terrorism and counterterrorism, including the excellent, highly recommended La Guerre de 20 ans, published in French 2 years ago. We also have Tania Mera, who is a senior research fellow and the lead of the program Rule of Law Responses to Terrorism at ICCT. She has a long experience in doing research and advising governments and international organizations on issues related to the prosecution of terrorism and the rule of law, and she's above all the lead author for this book. We also have Sofia Koller, who is a senior research analyst at the Counter-Extremism Project, CEP, in Berlin. and a well-known researcher in Germany with regard to the study of terrorism and notably female returnees, a topic on which she has written several reports. And not appearing in this webinar, but still appearing on the cover of the book because she was she played an important role in this project, in this research, is also, as I mentioned, Marina Herbach, who is a researcher at ICCT. Having said this, I will now pass on the floor to Mark Hecker for some observations from his research on France. Mark, the floor is yours.
Merci, Thomas. Thank you very much. I guess that if we start with France, it's because France holds a specific position in Western countries with regards to violent extremist offenders, and there are mainly two reasons for that. On the one hand, it represents the biggest contingent in absolute terms of individuals who travel to Syria or Iraq. Almost 1,500 French nationals or residents effectively managed to reach Syria or Iraq, and among them were 500 women. And more than 150 of these women have returned to France. And on the other hand, France is the first and so far only country where a woman-only cell of ISIS-related women attempted to perpetrate a major terrorist attack. This was the September 2016 Notre Dame plot, where a group of women tried to detonate a car in front of a cafe close to Paris, the Paris Cathedral. Several other plots were foiled by the police. I will not detail them, but you can find them in the book. The French approach to jihadism in general and female jihadists specifically has evolved immensely over the past decade. At the beginning of the Syrian networks, women were considered by the public and by the authorities almost as victims of men, often their husbands or future husbands, who had allegedly forced them or brainwashed them to travel to Syria. This gender-biased view changed for several reasons that I cannot present now for the sake of time, but again, you can find them in the book. So please do have a look at the book on ICCT's website. So what I'm going to do now in the 4 remaining minutes is focus on the 3 pillars of this study. So first prosecution, then prison, and then post-prison rehabilitation. So prosecution first. So my sample was composed of 94 cases, including 23 who traveled to a conflict zone. By far, the most common charge used by French magistrates is the association of terrorist wrongdoers, known in France as AMT. The incrimination was used in 82 cases out of 94. It's a very broad incrimination that encompasses membership in a terrorist organization, support, recruitment, preparation of a terrorist attack, etc. With regards to returnees, an important ruling was issued by the Court of Cassation in July 2016. This ruling said that the simple act of joining a terrorist organization constitutes an AMT offense, and the court underlined that the association of wrongdoers is considered as an independent infraction from the crimes perpetrated by the members of the terrorist organization. In other words, men and women can be considered terrorists even if they are not directly involved in violent acts. In practice, it means that a woman who joined ISIS in Syria and simply cooked for her jihadist husband is considered as a member of an association of terrorist wrongdoers. In my sample, the average sentence for a woman who traveled to Syria and had only a domestic life there is around 6 years imprisonment. The sentence can be much more severe when there is evidence that additional crimes were perpetrated. For instance, so far, the most severe sentence for a female returnee was 17 years imprisonment. This woman had supposedly been authorized by ISIS to come back to France on the condition that she perpetrate an attack against the Jewish community. Furthermore, she recruited several women on behalf of ISIS, including one who died only 1 month after her arrival in Syria. So that's it for prosecution. Now, prison. The most striking fact regarding female VEOs in French prisons is their growing number and proportion. The peak of terrorists in French prisons was reached in March 2020. At the time, there were approximately 540 terrorist inmates, including around 70 women. Today, there are approximately 400 terrorist inmates, including around 100 females, so almost 1/4 of French terrorist inmates are women currently. The rise in female VEOs inmates is linked to a change in France's repatriation policy. Indeed, between July 2022 and July 2023, 56 women were repatriated from Syria. Almost all of them were placed in pretrial detention. The way female VEOs are handled is based on the system created for men. It's a mix of dispersion and concentration. Terrorist inmates are evaluated in dedicated units, and at the end of the evaluation, there are 3 possibilities. The lower end of the spectrum is sent to ordinary detention. The higher end of the spectrum is sent to isolation. And in the middle, those who are deemed radical but likely to disengage are sent to radicalization processing areas, the so-called QPR. The first QPR for women opened in September 2021 in Rennes, and the second one has just opened or is due to open in the coming days in Roanne, not far from Lyon. And finally, post-prison rehabilitation. The French system that deals with former terrorist inmates is a mix of soft and hard measures decided and applied by actors who belong to different institutions, the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Justice, NGOs, etc. The main idea is to help those who may be able to reintegrate while impeding those who still adhere to the jihadist ideology and may pose a risk for society. The main disengagement program in France has been running for 5 years. It is called PAIRS and is organized around 3 pillars: social, psychological, and ideological. It has had around 300 participants, including 30% of women. And until recently, the most remarkable achievement of this program was the absence of recidivism. Unfortunately, on the 2nd of December 2023, a terrorist attack took place in Paris, resulting in the death of a tourist, and the attacker was a PAIRS participant who was suffering from serious mental health issues. But so far, no female participant was involved in a terrorist recidivism case in France. I leave it here and I thank you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Mark, for these insights from the case of France. Now turning to Tanya Mura for sharing insights from the case of the Netherlands.
Hi, thank you, Thomas. So I'll share just a few data on the women in the Netherlands and also some key observations from the interviews that we have conducted and the research in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, approximately 100 women have left for Syria and in Iraq. Our data set consists of 40 women who are currently either being investigated, who are waiting for appeal, or are already convicted. In our data set, only 5 females have neither traveled nor attempted to travel to Syria. So most of them have, in fact, either successfully reached Syria or they were prevented of reaching their final destination, either at home or in a third country. So considering that approximately 10 females have died and there are approximately still 35 women either in the camps or with terrorist groups in northwest Syria or returned to another country, the vast majority of the returnees have in fact been prosecuted or are being prosecuted. So if I can pick out just 3 short observations, and there's a lot more to say, as Mark said, and definitely would encourage everyone to download the book. So 3 short observations when it comes to prosecutions. In the Netherlands, the prosecutorial strategy has evolved, and you see now that women are being charged for membership of a terrorist organization and preparation of a terrorist offense with a standard sentence of 5 years. And those women who have taken their children also to the conflict zone can also be charged for child neglect offenses. What is worth mentioning is that there are no women which are being convicted in absentia. And this is because trials in absentia were initially part of the prosecutorial approach in the Netherlands, but has been abandoned. In the Netherlands, the defendant has the right to attend its trial, and several of the women had indicated that they wanted to be present at their trial. So as a consequence of this, the court would stay the proceedings, and the courts have done so several times and considered terminating the proceedings. And as a result of this, the Dutch government has decided to repatriate one of them, the first woman being Ilham Bey, and she was repatriated to the Netherlands and was able to stand trial here in a Dutch court. After that, several other women were also repatriated so they could stand trial. So the second observation is that in the Netherlands, unlike the other countries, once females are convicted, they stay in a special terrorist unit in Zwolle. So one of the risks in research is that if you have a concentration model, there might be a risk of radicalization of the inmates amongst itself. But this is less so the case in the Netherlands, because many of the women who are there already knew each other either from Syria or from their period before departure. What we also see in the Netherlands is that after a woman has served 2/3 of her sentence, she might be eligible to be transferred to a regular prison with less security measures, which is conducive for reintegration. However, in reality, we see that this has not occurred a lot because a lot of the women have already served some of their sentence during the pre-trial detention. And finally, the third observation that I would like to make is that after a release from prison, women can still be listed on the national list of terrorism, although efforts are now being made to delist a woman before she is released. And another measure that has a big impact on those women with a double nationality is that they can be deprived of their Dutch nationality after the judgment has become final. And this deprivation of nationality has a huge impact because that means they also won't have a national identity number, which makes it difficult for them to have a medical insurance, and it poses challenges when it comes to housing and education, but it also causes stress among the women, and it can also be counterproductive for reintegration. The decision for deprivation of nationality is taken by the Minister of Justice and Security, and there is relatively little to no discretionary power to consider this measure on an individual basis. So these are the three observations that I wanted to share from the Netherlands. Over back to you, Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Tanya. I'm now turning immediately to Sophia Köhler to share insights from the study of Germany. Sophia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. And I just wanted to mention that it's been a pleasure working with the 3 of you and 4 of you over the past year. Very happy to share our results. So from Germany, as Mark mentioned, there is a reason why these 4 countries were selected for the report. And one of the reasons is the significant amount of female returnees and especially women who have joined ISIS from these countries. In Germany, 1/4 of the 1,150 travelers from Germany were women, and we are counting at least 129 women who have returned. The sample for our reports or book now contains 49 cases of female VOs from Germany who have been or are currently being prosecuted for terrorism-related crimes with a connection to Syria and Iraq, including 39 returnees. So having said that, I want to also share 3 or even 4 observations from Germany. The first one is, and this has been mentioned before, is that really this growing motivation to prosecute female returnees and these VOs in general has been leading to a new conceptualization of terrorist membership beyond violent activities to really also include structural supports that has most often involved women. Clearly, one aspect, however, that I would like to highlight in the Germany case is that Germany really has been a pioneer in the prosecution of core international crimes, which included war crimes, crimes against humanity, and more recently also genocide. These are often related to the involvement of these women in crimes against enslaved Yazidis during their time with ISIS. So 12 German female returnees have been convicted for perpetrating or aiding and abetting these core international crimes. And I think this is a real strong signal also to other countries to go down that path and prosecute core international crimes. Interestingly, Germany has also been very actively accumulating charges, which means that individuals are charged for a combination of crimes. So indeed, in Germany, the majority of female VOs in our data set were indicted and convicted for some combination of terrorism-related charges, core international crimes, and national crimes such as child endangerment. Something that is still missing, however, in the prosecution is considering sexual and gender-based violence crimes when prosecuting female returnees. The second aspect is about prison, because due to this prosecutorial approach, female VOs are often sentenced to spend time in prison, which in Germany is really in the responsibility of the German state. So it depends on the state's approach, but are roughly the same in no specific units, but in the normal prison system. For the German female VOs in our sample, the average prison sentence pronounced in the verdict is a bit more than 4 years and 8 months. The majority also in our sample stayed in continuous or at least temporary pretrial detention, which means that in the end, since, as Tanya mentioned, also in Germany, many are released after having served 2/3 of their sentence, which means that the time that the women actually spend in prison is rather short, which gives less time to intensively work with them on rehabilitation and disengagement. It's a bit tricky to find out the numbers of female VOs incarcerated in Germany simply because there is no official statistics. But according to a civil society organization, Google, there are 27 female VOs incarcerated for Islamist terrorism-related charges in Germany. On rehabilitation, what I found very interesting also in the German case is that most female VOs had not been involved in criminal activity. At least 70% of the German women in our sample had no criminal record at all, and only 2 women had been convicted, but for non-violent crimes. And this is interesting because it might explain why what some interview partners had described as female VOs, and especially female returnees, not having the same criminal energy of regular detainees. So they're behaving rather well, rather inconspicuously in prison, are often released after 2/3 of their sentence, as I mentioned. So it's really too early to say much about the actual success of these kind of offers and so on, but really interview partners have reported that female returnees have really been accepting existing offers, both rehabilitation, but also next exit work, so disengagement, de-radicalization, really rather well. So I think this gives hope for some kind of optimism. However, we have to stay cautious because here we speak about the majority, and there are still some cases that demand caution once they're released from prison. The last observation I wanted to share is that really the lack of data, because there is no systematic and comprehensive data collection regarding extremists in German prisons. And I think actually the lack of gender disaggregated data is one of the challenges, and that is one of the reasons why we did this project, to bring some more data into this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophia, for this presentation. Now what I will do is also present myself some findings from the case of Belgium, and after that I will go back to the speakers with a few questions, and after that we'll turn to questions from the audience. So if you already have some questions, please raise them in the Q&A function that appears at the bottom of your screen. What can we say about Belgium? Well, probably similarly to the other countries, women represented about a fifth, 20% of the female contingent that traveled to Syria and Iraq. Although upon return, that ratio is a little bit higher. Now they represent about 30% of the returnees because the rate of return among female travelers was higher than the rate of return among male travelers, partly because confined in the household, they were less at risk of being killed in combat, also partly because there were these repatriation operations that sort of facilitated the return of some of these women. In total, there's been 169 women that have been listed at some point by the Belgian Counter-Terrorism Fusion Center, CUTA, the coordination unit for the threat analysis. And basically, out of these 169 women listed for jihadi terrorism by CUTA, my sample, I was able to collect court cases for 118 women that have been prosecuted in Belgium for jihadi terrorism since 2012. That is a very large sample. At the same time, it should be highlighted that this sample includes 50 trials in absentia, so 50 women that were tried and convicted while still being in Syria and Iraq. In Belgium, there's been a prosecutorial shift. So at first, these women who traveled, returned, were not necessarily prosecuted, perhaps perceived more as victims. But that perception shifted around 2015, 2016. And indeed, we can show very objectively that the number of trials has increased regularly and significantly between 2014 and 2019, particularly. And Belgium has reached a very high rate of prosecution for female violent extremist offenders. Above 70% of these 169 women that I mentioned, above 70% of them have been prosecuted and most of them convicted for terrorism. In most of the cases, they are convicted for membership to a terrorist organization. Actually, almost 100% of them are convicted for membership of a terrorist organization, sometimes in combination with another charge. So similarly also to what can be seen notably in France. And the reason for that is that because prosecution for participation to a terrorist organization is a very easy route to pursue for prosecution because the threshold for evidence is quite low, and also because there's been a lot of trials essentially repeating the same arguments one after the other. These women are mostly sentenced or convicted to 3 to 5 years in prison, but actually in Belgium, interestingly, oftentimes in about half of the cases in the sample, particularly if you exclude trials in absentia, these women are convicted to a prison sentence, but that is partly or fully covered by a reprieve under probation. So that means that about half of these women don't stay very long in prison or don't stay in prison after their conviction. And so that is certainly something to take into account because it has an impact potentially on their rehabilitation, reintegration trajectory. Currently, as of today, there are 10 women, 10 female jihadi violent extremist offenders in prison and 6 under electronic monitoring, so 16 women. In the book, you will find the number of 18, 17 of them in prison, which was the figure from summer 2023. And what we can see is that the number of female violent extremist offenders in prison in Belgium increased steadily between 2016 until 2023. In prison, originally, these women sort of were a source of concern among staff, but that was quickly appeased, and very quickly, staff came to realize that these female violent extremist offenders were essentially quiet, peaceful inmates, not troublemakers. No particular risk of radicalization or proselytism was identified with regard to these women, which are under a regime of diffusion. So basically, they are dispersed across all the institutions for female inmates. across the country. So very similarly to the regime that is in application for men, with the slight exception that for men there is a special unit for the most problematic individuals in terms of radicalization, which is not applicable for women. But again, these women are not really active in radicalization behavior. Therefore, this was not considered as particularly needed. And finally, last point, just to highlight that we could identify 58 women that have participated to a rehabilitation program in prison or after prison. So actually, this is almost all of the women in our sample, except those that were tried in absentia. So that means basically that the majority of the women that were convicted for terrorism have undergone a rehabilitation program, which represents about 15 to 25% of the cases handled by the rehabilitation services. So therefore, the majority of the cases are still male terrorist offenders. So this is, in a nutshell, what I could say from my research in Belgium. Of course, there is a lot more than that in the book. So please, by all means, download the book, read the book, and don't hesitate to get back to us if you have any question about this. Now, what we would like to do for another 15 minutes maybe is just throwing a few additional questions to the speakers before, again, turning to the audience for you questions. So starting with you, Mark, I'd like to ask you two questions. And the first one is, and if you could answer, of course, very briefly, that would be appreciated. But what can we say comparing across the countries, because we've done that cross-cutting analysis in our book, what can we say about the profile of these women?
Okay, well, first, it was not sociological research. So our aim was not to have the sociological profiles of these female VEOs. And we definitely wanted to study prosecution, prisons, rehabilitation, that is to say the way states handle these female VEOs. Nonetheless, there were occasionally sociological elements that appeared in the court decisions or during the interviews. For instance, the number of conversions to Islam seems to be quite important among female VEOs and apparently more important than among men VEOs. Another characteristic seems to be the prevalence of sexual and gender-based violence, even though it was impossible for us to provide statistics on these issues. We did manage, however, to have figures and statistics about criminal records. In France, approximately 15% of the women had a criminal record, usually for very minor offense, and it's less than 10% in the other three countries. And that's a very striking difference between men and female VEOs. The crime-terror nexus is much stronger among men than among women. So as you already said in your introduction, we had 277 women in our database. The average age of their terrorist offense is around 24 to 25 years old. The vast majority of the female VEOs in the sample have the nationality of the prosecuting country, sometimes alongside a second nationality. Only a small minority of cases in a small minority of cases, this woman did not have the citizenship of the prosecuting country, which is consistent with previous findings on male terrorist offenders. What else can I say? Well, 52% traveled to a conflict zone, 16.5% attempted but failed to reach a conflict zone, and 31.5% did not attempt to travel. What's more, the vast majority, more than 90% of the female VEOs in our sample were affiliated with ISIS at some point, again confirming the massive power of attraction that ISIS had on certain European youth. And the last element that I want to mention is the indictment period. For all 277 female VEOs in our sample, it ranged between April 2011 and June 2022, and more than 90% of the cases covered parts of the period 2014 to 2017, which is consistent with the peak of ISIS activities. On average, and that's my final word, the indictment period was of 2 years and 3 months, so pretty long.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe one more question very briefly. I know it's challenging, but what are the biggest challenges when dealing with female returnees and female violent extremist offenders?
Okay, so I see 6 challenges, but I'll be very quick. The first one is evidence. So knowing what they did precisely in Syria and Iraq is very complicated. That's because most of the women had mainly a domestic life. So it's hard to get intel about what was going on at home. For instance, it's difficult to know if they had Yazidi slaves. The second challenge is the volume of female VOs. That's especially a challenge in countries that decided to repatriate dozens of women in a short period of time. It creates pressure on the prison system. The general population of female prisoners is usually much smaller than the population of male inmates. It means that if you suddenly add dozens of female VOs, their concentration in female prisons will be quite important. And there's a risk that for the moment seems to be under control of ideological dissemination. Third challenge, war trauma. Many women who were recently repatriated belonged to ISIS until the end. Some of them were present during the battles of Mosul, Raqqa, or Barouz. Some of them lost children. They also endured hard conditions in the Kurdish camps. Psychologists who deal with them in prison usually describe the issue of trauma as a major challenge, as the psychologists are not trained to deal with war trauma. They're not used to war trauma. The fourth challenge is children. Most of the female returnees have children. For instance, more than 300 children have come back from Syria to France. And women are usually separated from their children as soon as they come back to their home country. Some female returnees put up a wall in that this topic prevents them from talking about anything else. The fifth challenge is what I call emotional versus intellectual disengagement. When you talk to professionals in prison who work with returnees, they tell you that many of them distance themselves from ISIS because they lived horrendous experiences within this organization. One professional highlighted that this form of emotional disengagement is not enough, and that an intellectual disengagement is also needed. What he meant is that an ideological work is also needed so that these women do not fall again into jihadism. And finally, the sixth challenge is understanding and assessing the risks. It's not easy because for women, the risks are not necessarily linked to violence. Most of the returnees probably did not resort to violence when they were in Syria or Iraq, but that does not mean that they did not play a role in supporting a terrorist organization. And if we focus solely on violence, we may miss the point and end up misestimating the danger these women pose. Yet, for the majority, this danger is more related to their central role in an authoritarian project, in their capacity to transmit radical values to their children, than in their ability to perpetrate attacks. That's why, again, the ideological work is so important. I leave it here. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Mark. Also 2 questions for you, Tanya, and I see already some, I'm monitoring the questions that are being posed in the Q&A, so don't hesitate to pose more questions. I already see some very interesting questions there, which I will not miss and not fail to ask to the speakers. But to you, Tanya, first, what are the crimes that these women have been convicted for?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, so if you look at the data set across all the 4 countries, it probably won't come as a surprise to many of the researchers and practitioners who are joining us today at the webinar. It is a membership or participation in a terrorist organization. So nearly 80% of the women have been charged for membership of a terrorist organization. I mean, there are certain, maybe even obvious advantages. Some of them you also mentioned, Thomas. I mean, they might, the low evidentiary threshold, to prosecute for membership offenses, there might be less of a need to collect and rely on evidence from the conflict zone, which, although it has improved, is still sometimes challenging. But at the same time, it also a little bit blurs to the extent that it is difficult to see what have they actually been doing, as Mark also previously mentioned. So what we have done in our research, we have broken down all the court cases where there has been a charge for membership. And we have tried to analyze and go through the court cases and see what kind of activities have they actually been involved with. Because we also see, although that's not, the focus of our research, that also many men are also convicted for a membership of a terrorist organization, but seem to be getting higher sentences. So we said we need to analyze those cases. So if we break it down, we see that the vast majority have indeed been providing logistic support, and it is cooking and cleaning, and have had a lot of activities within the household. The second category within on activities that we can see is assisting and arranging travel. This applies to the women who have both, traveled there, but also those who have failed to travel. And the third activity we see the most under the conviction for membership offenses is engaged in propaganda activities. So it is important to look also beyond just the membership and try to see, what kind of activities they have been involved with. And it is clear that indeed most of them have not been involved in directly in violent activities or engaging directly in the armed jihad. If we look a little bit further, what we also see, we have the terrorist offenses, but what we also, if you look at the core international crimes, we see that the most common one is pillaging as a war crime. Now, so far, there are, in fact, only 2 countries that have been successfully been prosecuting women for core international crimes. In the Netherlands, it's, in fact, only 1. And I must add, this is a woman who has not traveled to the conflict zone, but she has been charged for and convicted for outrage upon a personal dignity, for posing degrading remarks on a photo and sharing this online in line with the ISIS media strategy. In Germany, as Sophia already mentioned, they are far more ahead, and there we see more convictions for core international crimes. And 14 women have been convicted for pillaging. Now, pillaging as a war crime also poses some challenges to prove, because, first of all, not all the women have themselves appropriated directly themselves the property, and it's also sometimes difficult to ascertain whether the women willingly and moved into that property. We don't see such prosecutions for core international crimes yet in Belgium and in France. There are several reasons for that, which is too detailed, and I would advise you to have a look at the book. But we know that in France, there are some ongoing investigations which also include core international crimes. So the third offense that I would briefly, or type of offense that I briefly would like to mention, is child neglect offenses. So we know that a majority of the women had children either before departure, or they have conceived children and given birth to children while being in the conflict zone. And what we see now is that in all the countries, several of the women are now also being prosecuted for the domestic offense, child neglect. There are some differences across the 4 countries, but overall, this crime has, women are starting to be prosecuted for this crime only with respect to the children they have taken from their home countries to the conflict zone. We do not see a lot of convictions or prosecutions for the children who were born there. So this is a relatively new development where you see that there's also an increased focus on child neglect offenses and the impact it has on their children. So this is a bit broad overview on some of the most common crimes for which the women have been prosecuted for.
Thanks, Tanya. And maybe just a second question, but very briefly in 1 minute, if you can. Do women receive shorter sentences, particularly compared to men, obviously?
Yeah, and this is the one I would like to have the whole afternoon, if you don't mind, because there are so many things to say about it. But I'll try, because I know this is something which is being picked up a lot also in the media, and I think it's important that we try to explain a little bit what our data shows. Yes, it appears that women who have not been directly involved in combat functions or in violent activities seem to receive relatively lenient sentences. This is not because they are a woman. This is because of the type of activities they have been involved with. In the report, we show, the differences in sentencing in Netherlands with an average of 1.77, Germany 4.52, France 6, and Belgium 5.44. So what I think it's important, I want to briefly mention 5 points on why we see these discrepancies and why it is relatively considered low. When women are engaged, like in France, in actually plotting and carrying out terrorist attacks, then they will definitely receive much higher sentences. And we only see that in the French data set. We don't see that in the other 3 countries. When women are convicted for core international crimes, like in Germany, this can also lead to higher sentences. When it comes to the Dutch data set, I think it's really important to realize it's incredibly small. It's 28 cases. So any outliers would have a big impact on the average. And finally, I think it's important to mention that the length of sentence which is pronounced is not the same as the time spent in prison. As mentioned earlier, pretrial detention and early release can reduce time in prison. But we should also realize that when women are tried in absentia, like in France and in Belgium, they do not spend any time in prison because they're not there. They're still abroad. And in fact, our data shows that while Netherlands has maybe the lowest length of sentences, it has the highest imprisonment rate. And then the last point that I would like to make is that, as you also mentioned, Thomas, in Belgium, sentences up to 4 years can be replaced with a probationary reprieve. And in Germany, we also see that sentences up to 2 years can be replaced by probation. So these also affect the time actually spent in prison. So these are just a few points I wanted to highlight on the length of sentences and how to look at this data. Thank you.
Thanks indeed, Tanya. Turning to Sophia, and I am conscious of the time. I see a lot of very interesting questions being asked in the chat. But Sophia, still 2 questions to you as well. The first question about the impact of children on the management of female VO, because obviously some female returnees came back with their children. Mark already touched on this point, so maybe you can also touch on that point very briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that our research clearly showed that it's an important factor. It has an impact on the management in a variety of ways. So first of all, overall parents in general are considered more sensitive to the restrictions in prisons, which means that being a parent of especially of a small child is a factor when deciding the prison sentence and the modality of the prison sentence. If the children are very small babies that depend on their parents, especially on their mothers in our case, there is also the question whether or not the child can or will be staying in the prison with its mother, which creates additional challenges. In several countries, it's theoretically possible to let children up to a certain age stay in prison. with their mothers, but it's often logistically not possible because there is a lack of specifically adapted cells in prison, a lack of staff, lack of pedagogical support in that sense. And because the welfare of the child is such a decisive factor when taking these decisions, it's really a very exceptional practice to have children stay with their mothers in prison. Which also means that the psychological stress that comes from being separated from a child should not be underestimated, especially if we consider that many of the female returnees have spent building up a very symbiotic relationship with the children during the long time that some of them spent in the camp. So this kind of separation can be very challenging and has to be addressed. In many cases, we see that children is the #1 topic for female VEOs. And this is twofold. So it can be a very strong motivating factor for women to comply with the certain restrictions, to engage with the rehabilitation offers and so on, because the perspectives of reuniting with their children or being able to see their children more often, for example, gives them a high motivation to behave well in prison and gives also them a positive future outlook. At the same time, children also be a vulnerability factor because it can kind of undermine the process of rehabilitation if we consider that it's sometimes the only issue that they want to talk about, and that it can also contribute to continuing kind of a narrative of victimization, not accepting the accountability that they also have in bringing their children into the situation or even the crimes that they have committed to their own children. And that's why they cannot see them.
Thanks, Sophia. And another question, which is actually a question from Alexander Korn from Violence Prevention Network, which is about basically the gender-specific aspects or gender-sensitive aspects of rehabilitation programs. What did we find out about this aspect, particularly in our research?
Yes, I think it's a very interesting topic. I can also invite you to read up the report also on the other aspects, but specifically on these insights. I will just mention 2 aspects that I think are most important when it comes to gender-specific aspects. Is that the first one is trauma, because especially female returnees will likely have experienced multiple traumas while being in Syria and Iraq. And it's very important that staff that engage with these women are trained to recognize, but also possibly address these traumas effectively, or being able to refer them to a specialized staff. These kind of traumas can include the death of a child, death of a husband, considering that many have married several times while being abroad, sexual abuse, and this also comes on top of the other war-related traumas of living in a conflict zone for a longer period of time. These kind of experience can result in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which is interesting, reportedly often undiagnosed for women, because the symptoms among women are different than those of men, and there is still a lack of research into these kind of topics. This aspect is particularly relevant because PTSD can hamper disengagement efforts. So if it's not diagnosed, if it's not addressed correctly and so on, it can be a specific risk factor of recidivism among female VEOs. So that's why it's so important to have more research on the topic and have also specifically trained staff in that regard. The second aspect I wanted to mention is the topic of motherhood. We have heard that many have brought their children to ISIS, but there are also a significant number of women who had their first child while being in ISIS territory. So their understanding and experience of being a mother has probably, or has in many cases, been weaponized by ISIS, has been kind of constructed via ISIS propaganda. And this is why it's necessary to not only understand that, but also be able to address it and help female returnees rethink what motherhood means and entails for them, and kind of reconfiguring their understanding of motherhood. So I think in total, maybe to sum it up, also the other factors, I think it's really important to have specific training for staff, to also have staff, rehabilitation, prison staff, but also those working on prosecution, to reflect on their possible own gender stereotypes that underpin the approaches and potentially can affect their effectiveness.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Sophia. Maybe I'll make one small intervention to cover one last aspect of our cross-cutting research before indeed we turn to the audience, because there's so many questions and I really want to give a chance to basically ask these questions to the speakers. But maybe let me just make a few points about the issue of false compliance, which has basically arisen in the course of a research, and false compliance basically being about individuals, in this case, female violent extremist offenders, trying to deceive the authorities or faking their de-radicalization, basically, and potentially then returning to their to terrorism. And that has been a really rising concern among policymakers in light of some prominent cases of recidivism over the past few years, mostly around men, but also about the perception that some of the women in the camps in Syria, notably, were perceived as faking their de-radicalization to be repatriated. It is important to distinguish between non-compliance and false compliance in prison. Non-compliance basically is about not participating, for instance, to rehabilitation program, whereas false compliance is to participate to some of these rehabilitation disengagement programs, but pretending to be de-radicalized when one is not. So basically hiding someone's true ideology and intentions. When it comes to false compliance, then specifically leaving non-compliance aside, it is important to realize, because it is indeed a concern, but it is also important to realize that false compliance is quite considered as quite normal, it's quite frequent within the prison system. And that can be for a whole lot of reasons. People can basically minimize their role, their offenses and their role in terrorist organization because they want to reunite more quickly with their children, for instance, or they want to benefit early from an early release. It is only problematic, concerning, when that is done with the particular intention of escaping the vigilance of the authorities to go back to terrorism, potentially commit an attack or travel back to Syria or other places of conflict. And that is actually, false compliance with such bad intentions is actually quite rare, if not very rare. And actually, it is important that across our research, across the 4 countries, most stakeholders that we spoke to, that we interviewed for this project, whether prison staff, prison directors, security services, rehabilitation staff, they were all almost unanimously confident that they have the tools, they have the methodology to detect those cases of false compliance. But indeed, still, it can happen. It is possible that individuals manage still to deceive the authorities, to hide their intentions, and indeed to do something after their release. It is exceptional, but possible. And when that happens, obviously it gets a lot of media coverage, and potentially it can discredit the whole security system and the rehabilitation programs. That is why it is indeed important to treat this very seriously, and why it is important to have the right risk assessment tools in place, the right mechanism to properly exchange information between all the different services, and to avoid any complacency on this issue. And that leads me to address the issue of recidivism, which Martin Meder from NCTV asked at the very beginning of this session. Indeed, the risk of recidivism is one of the risks, and Mark already alluded to this. It's only one of the risks that we are confronted with when violent extremist offenders are released from prison. There is the risk that they go back to terrorism by committing an attack or traveling to a conflict zone, potentially financing terrorism or rejoining an organization. That risk of recidivism, which potentially can lead to a second conviction for terrorism, that is quite rare, statistically quite exceptional, but it can happen. And when it does happen, to answer Martin's question, it will most often happen within a relatively short time frame after the release. usually within the first 6 or 12 months after the release. Having said this, what our research also suggests, although we cannot put a very strong, hard number against it, is that a number of women after the release from prison might go back or might remain committed to the ideology, or might go back to some form of extremist milieus with a husband, with a family, or in a neighborhood that is considered as problematic, as radicalized. That is not in itself considered as a case of recidivism. It is not considered as an immediate threat to security, but it certainly is a concern and certainly is something that should be and actually is monitored by the various services, security services, and social preventive services. So I will stop here with those interventions, and indeed now turn to questions from the audience, and there's been a number of them. There are different types of questions as well. One question is about methodology, and I will keep that maybe for the very end. But to take another question from